integration policies, social control of minorities, and so on, okay? How everything is framed in terms of security. So why immigrants are perceived as posing a threat. And the major trend that I identified on both sides of the Atlantic was the use of immigration policy to fight terrorism and the use of counter-terrorist policies to control immigration. These blurring of these, the distinction between counter-terrorist policy, immigration policies, being based on the conflation of the notion of immigrants, foreigners, the others, and potential terrorists. So in Frontiers of Fear, I analyzed the securitarization process before and after 9/11, and then I critically evaluated the actual outcomes of these security-driven policies. The major findings were that more border controls do not limit the numbers of illegal immigrants. Restrictive immigration policies do not provide more security. On the contrary, they created more insecurity because of the climate of fear. They fuel fear among public opinion, who are quite distressed that there are still terrorist attacks, on-ground terrorists, an increasing number of immigrants, legal or illegal, but also among minorities targeted by discriminatory practices with the radicalization of some minorities, especially in Europe, with the radicalization of young Muslims. So it was not a very optimistic book. No more security, but less security, less civil liberties, more homegrown terrorists, more illegal immigrants, and still the governments, the American government, but also most of the European governments want to do more of the same, meaning it's clear that border controls do not work, but they tend to put more money, more staff to pursue the same policy despite the negative outcomes. And we know that the vast majority of immigrants are not terrorists and that most of the terrorists are not immigrants. At the end of this work, I realized that there was something missing. The book is already, I don't know, 300 pages, okay? So, but I say, okay, there is something missing, something very important. The perspective of immigrants, minority groups targeted by security measures. And I wanted to listen to them. I wanted to understand their perception of the security process. How do they feel? How do they react? And it was the purpose of this book I'm going to present today. How does it feel to be a threat? So I switched from the public policies, the perspective of the governments, to these people, okay? Those who are targeted by the securitarization of immigration and integration policies. So, I expanded the notion of securitarization to the notion of security governance. So what is security governance? It's a process through which Western political elite, such as governments, leading political parties, associated policy networks, public opinion, and the media, construct immigration and ethno-religious diversity as a security threat. Typical aspects include restrictive border controls intended to fight terrorism, plus the idea that anti-terrorist policy can curb illegal migration flows and to police minorities. The security-immigration nexus is apparent in the way in which politicians and bureaucrats view policies on the integration of migrants and of ethnic minorities as a means to counter threats. Here I have to explain that counter threats, all kinds of threats, because not only immigrants, but foreigners, irrespective of their legal status, the others with a capital O, are suspected of posing different threats. Socio-economic threat, by taking jobs from the natives, curbing their wages and so on, but also cultural threat, okay, because of their ethnic, religious differences, okay? But also threat to public safety by supposedly increasing delinquency, criminality, and at the very end of the process, at being potential terrorists. Okay? So we have here something that technically, sorry for that, we call objective or realistic threat, okay, socio-economic threat, and symbolic threat, threat to national identity, culture, our way of life, our belief, and everything. The nexus, the security-immigration nexus, is further consolidated by negative stereotypes propagated by the mass media and official public discourse that, in turn, fuels concern about the willingness of immigrants to integrate into the host societies. I want to emphasize here that the notion of security governance does not include the government's policymakers only. So from the migrant, from the minority perspective, these people are not only targeted by public policies, but they're also targeted by official discourse, nativist discourse, by different kinds of actors, public, private actors, that are part of this security governance process. Then I started to read and read and read and read almost everything that was published on both sides of the Atlantic, thanks to Megan. She's not here, but I want to congratulate Megan because she did a wonderful job as my research assistant. She suffered a lot, especially when I asked her to find findings on the European sites where it's quite difficult to have any reliable data, especially when you deal with ethnic minorities or religious minorities, because we have no data, okay? So I asked Megan to do something almost impossible, and she did it very well. And I realized that all the literature about how these people targeted by security measures react was divided into two categories. There were two scenarios. The optimist one, okay, security governance, discrimination, but despite nativism, despite xenophobic feelings, anti-migrant policies and everything, well, you know, these people were doing not so bad, you know, trying to integrate, integrative acculturation first, okay, cultural integration, then socio-economic integration, and then democratic incorporation, okay? So this is the optimistic scenario, okay? Despite securitarization, despite discrimination, well, these people are okay, okay? Not great, but they're okay. And then there is the pessimistic scenario. Well, discrimination, fueling a sense of alienation, then social isolation, political distrust, and separatism, or at the very end of the process for a tiny minority, radicalization. Okay? Not only terrorist radicalization, that's only one part of radicalization, but you can have religious radicalization, political radicalization, protest politics, okay, is part of the radicalization process. And the terrorist radicalization is at the very, very, very end of the continuum. So I say, okay, how is it possible? How is it possible that similar context, okay, restrictive policies, discrimination, violation of human rights, violation of civil liberties, okay, have similar context in the US, in European countries, can produce something very different, okay? The okay scenario and the oh my God scenario, okay? So I say we need to understand what's going on. So I try to identify the key questions. And for those who attended my teaching, you know that I always insist on something, doing research. It's not about the findings, it's about the questions, okay? When you do research, you search for the relevant questions. Okay? That's stage number one, and that's the most important stage. So, I identified specific questions raised by security governance. Does securitarization push minorities who feel alienated towards or away from particular forms of political participation? Maybe there is no dichotomy in my previous slide, you know. Maybe some people who may be well integrated, okay, socioeconomically well integrated, may still want to protest. Okay? They don't want to vote, but maybe they want to protest. Does the fear of being treated as a threat increase or decrease their willingness to integrate or participate in politics at all? For example, do Muslims in Europe feel more Muslim, although I'm still waiting for the definition of what a Muslim is or should be, okay, because they're targeted as Muslims, okay? Does this create a common identity, okay? And if so, does this identity generate specific forms of mobilization? Is there any connection between the participatory forms that immigrants and minorities adopt and their resentment of being discriminated against? Ultimately, I think it was important to examine the ways in which the effects of securitarization and the patterns of organization and mobilization are related. Okay? Why have these security-driven policies fostered such diverse reactions among targeted migrant communities? From, okay, I do nothing, I don't care, I stay home, okay, low profile, or, well, I want to mobilize to react against security governance as an Hispanic, as a Muslim, as a European young immigrant, okay? Do I want to protest? Do I want to be a member of an organization, political, religious, ethnic organization? Or do I want to be elected as the president of the United States or one European countries? Do I want to radicalize? Do I want to join the jihad? You have very, various patterns of mobilizations. And I also wanted to understand if there are any relationship between all these patterns, okay? For example, if you feel discriminated, is it an incentive to naturalize? And if so, is it an incentive to register, to vote? Okay. conventional political participation. So, these are the questions I address in the book. And that's the theoretical part of it. When you try to understand how people feel, react, okay, to understand their goals, their expectations, or their resentment, okay, you need to take at least two dimensions into account. The context, okay, political opportunity structure, okay, and the people, okay, ethnic group, ethnicity theories. Okay? That's, you know, it takes two to tango, okay? You have a stage and you have people playing something, okay, on that stage. The problem is that I quickly realized that the traditional POS or the traditional ethnic group theories were rather limited. They were rather limited because they did not include something very important, subjectivity, okay? Not only how these people are objectively integrated based on their socioeconomic status, level of education, and so on, but how do they feel integrated? Not only discrimination, okay, we have some data, discrimination at school, labor, in the job market, housing, okay, access to healthcare, but how these people perceived discrimination. So I realized that I had to update it. The traditional perspectives. The traditional perspective on political opportunity structures, how the context is perceived by immigrants and minorities. Ethnic group approach, how migrants define themselves. What are their expectations? Okay. How do they define their identity or lack of identity? Okay. Then I combine this into the incorporation box. Okay. Incorporation box, knowing that there are different spheres of incorporation. You can be quite well integrated in the labor market, for example, without being fluent in the language, okay? Or you can be extremely fluent in the language and being unemployed. Okay, so there are different spheres of incorporation. Trends, straight line, upward, downward, or a complete failed integration. But also the key variable was the subjective integration. How people perceive themselves, comparing, contrasting with other groups, not only the dominant group, but also other minority groups. Finally, I tried to reach the mobilization box, okay, with different level, different kinds of mobilization, knowing that traditionally books on participation, political incorporation, tend to focus on political participation, naturalization, vote, okay? And I suspected that it was not good enough because there are so many other ways to mobilize. That's why I included unconventional mobilization, okay? Social mobilization, cultural mobilization, to be part of an association, including protest politics. So you have activism, but also active non-incorporation. People who are eligible for naturalization. People who are eligible for voting, but decide not to do so. So it's an active non-incorporation. I decided to do nothing. Okay, so on that basis, I added the social psychology literature, because you remember, I say subjectivity. That's the missing dimension in existing literature. So I added, and I used this model of coping with collective disadvantage that I translated for the purpose of my research, and I applied this model to subjective perception of security governance. Okay? So you have different elements that are very important. For example, the role of emotions, reaction to emotions, anger or trust, okay? Or the idea that you can't do something by yourself, but if you can convince 10,000 people to join you, well, you have the notion of group efficacy, collective action, and so on. So I added these ingredients to my own research. So, on that basis, I decided to cut the global process into 3 stages. Okay? Stage number 1, discrimination. Okay? How immigrants, minority groups targeted by security governance perceived discrimination. Stage number 2, sorry, I'm going to present it later, the relationship between perceived discrimination and perceived integration. Stage number 3, the relationship between perceived integration and patterns of mobilization. Okay? So I segmented the process in order to work on all these very complex relationships. And between perception of securitization, so I don't want to bother you with all the data and the statistics. You can, read the book. But very negative among Hispanic in the US, Muslims in the US, Muslim immigrants in Europe, and the second generation and more Muslims in Europe. Okay, it was the main categories I selected for my research. Okay, it's not exactly a breaking news, okay? Hispanic Muslims in the US dislike racial profiling, violation of civil liberties, the fact for Hispanic of being suspected, all the percentage were extremely high, okay? But what was interesting, level of perceived group discrimination. Group discrimination. Hispanic. Do you think that Hispanic are targeted by security governance? And the Hispanics say, yes, we are, okay? Very high percentage. Muslim in the US, very low. That, I was quite puzzled. I mean, okay, are they in complete denial? They say, well, we are discriminated by securitization, but as a group, oh, it's okay. Okay, there is something strange here. But I go back to the traditional variables, explanatory variables. They're socioeconomically mainstream. So they tend to believe that despite they're targeted at the airport, for example, okay, hey you, special line, as a group in the American society, it's okay. They're not targeted as much as we think they think. But quite interesting. They say, okay. And when you ask Muslim in the US, do you think that all the groups are discriminated? Well, they mention Hispanic first. Well, we are less discriminated than Hispanic as a group. So it's not too bad, okay? It's not fine, not great, but it's okay. Muslim immigrants in Europe, very high level of perceived discrimination. because they're not mainstream. There is an objective discrimination against them, okay? At school, job market, housing, just name it. So as a group, they really feel discriminated against. And second generation, very high. And that's not good, because these people are born, raised in Europe. Some of them, when there is a jus soli, are French citizens, or, you know, and maybe now, because the German legislation has been changed last week, some of them now in Germany will also be able to become German citizens. Okay, for those who are not familiar, in most European countries, it's not because you're born somewhere that you automatically become a citizen. Okay, you have people from the second and the third generation that are perfectly fluent in German, okay, or in Greek, in Italian, but they're not citizens. And this is, I will go back to that, this is very problematic, okay, because they don't perceive discrimination on the basis of their migrant status. They're not newcomers, but they perceive very high level of discrimination because they think that they are second-rank citizens or not citizens at all. Perceived of individual discrimination, very interesting. As I say, for Hispanic, they say we are highly discriminated as a group. But when it comes to, but what about you? They say, oh no, it's okay. In my daily life, it's okay. I think in complete denial. But remember, not all Hispanic lives in Arizona. Okay? And this book is part of an international research project I co-directed with colleagues from the Sorbonne. And I have one of my former PhD students, Clarina Moreno-Saldivar, who conducted interviews of Hispanic in Arizona and in New York. Well, in Arizona, they say we are extremely discriminated against as a group and as an individual. But in New York, yes, as a group, yeah, because of the national coverage of what's going on in Arizona and everything. But on the personal basis in New York, they say, no, it's okay. It's New York. Okay, we can do what we want. Okay? There is no problem. To someone say, your question is pointless. What do you mean? As an Hispanic in New York? Yeah, well, it's fine. Location matters. Muslim in the US, individual low, so this is consistent. Muslim immigrants in Europe, very high, consistent. But second generation, low at the individual level. Why? Because, as I say, some of them are citizens. And at the end of the day, they say, okay, we are discriminated against as a group, but as a French citizen, for example, I can still vote. I can still express my discontent. I can still express my voice and say, hey, are you crazy? Okay. So, it's quite interesting. What is even more interesting is the relationship between this perceived discrimination at the group and individual level and the attitudes toward society. You remember, I wanted to understand the two scenarios, the optimistic one and the pessimistic one. And one of the arguments of a lot of scholars, policymakers and journalists is to say, but these people anyway don't like American values, or they don't want to assimilate, they don't like French Republican principles, they don't drink tea at 5 p.m., whatever, okay? So they don't like us, so it may explain why they tend to not to vote, to live in ethnic enclaves by choice, and then to radicalize. So I dig further. Guess what? They all have a very positive opinions of the host society. Okay? Muslims in the US love America. Hispanic in the US love America. American values. They raise the flag. Barbecue on Labor Day. Just name it. Okay? They love it. And they want to be part of it. Except for one group. Except for one group. Second, third generation young Muslim in Europe. Why? And this is what we call the integration paradox. This is because they are integrated that they tend to be more sensitive to discrimination, because they are more educated, because they are familiar with very subtle form of discrimination. They can understand. And the reaction is to say, why do I need, or do I should have like French values, French people, for example, knowing that they don't like me? Although I'm born in this country, I've been raised in this country, I try my best, and still I'm suspected of being a terrorist. You know what? You. Okay? That's when we interview some young people, it was, you know, the F word. Okay. So, remember, it was stage number 1, discrimination. Okay? And the reaction in terms of cultural assimilation. Stage number 2, what about integration? And here, I don't want to bother you with all the details, but I didn't want to work on objective discrimination, because that's not the purpose of my research, okay? What I wanted to do is to understand how these people feel themselves. Do they feel integrated? And more importantly, what was their definition of integration? Okay. Was it conformity, to join the mainstream, or to be able to join the mainstream, the labor market and everything, but to keep some ethno-religious specificities at home, for example? Public, private spheres, you know, I wanted to understand what were their expectations. So I focus on the notion of subjective integration based on the acculturation literature and different kind of cultural acculturation in relation to subjective integration. So, I don't have time to mention all the findings, so I decided to focus on the American side. Okay, religious ethnic identification. Hispanic, very high. Very high. They really feel that they're not American. But they don't feel so Hispanic, because that's, I know it's maybe slightly disturbing. When you ask Hispanic, are you very religious? Do you define you as being Hispanic? They say yes. But actually, when you dig further, you understand that when they say we feel Hispanic, it's only by default. We are Hispanic because we are not non-Hispanic. But we are from Cuba, we are from Mexico, we are from many other Latino countries. That's why they have a very low group consciousness. So for all these people who fear a strong ethnic Latino community, well, I have a good news. There is no strong Latino Hispanic community, okay? You put all these people together in the same room, they will argue, they dislike each other, except when it comes to deal with non-Hispanic. You understand? So they're Hispanic by default. They're Hispanic because they're not non-Hispanic. And that's important. And the Cuban feel less discriminated against than people from Guatemala, okay? But black Cubans feel much more discriminated than white Cubans. Okay? So when some Latino studies focus on political mobilization of Latinos, well, I'm sorry, you have to take into account the relationship between all these subgroups, and not only those who are more conservative, voting Republicans, or the majority of Hispanic now voting for the Democratic Party. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. Okay, then Muslims, very high religious ethnic identification, especially in the US. The situation is much more difficult in Europe, where most countries are secular. Okay, but not only in France. Okay, many other European countries are mostly secular, and there is no strong religious identity among even the dominant group. Okay, you ask the French, yeah, the majority of French will say, yeah, we are Catholics. Okay, they're cultural Catholics or social Catholics. And then when you ask them, do you believe in God? Yeah, suddenly you only have 23%. Okay? So in the US, you understand, it's very different. And this is something I try to explain to my colleagues working on similar topics in Europe. And I say, yeah, you have to change your frame when you study the US. Okay? Because religiosity is very important in this country. So for Muslims, it's easier to express a strong sense of religious or ethnic identification. They also have a strong group consciousness. Why? Compare, contrast to the Hispanics. The majority of Hispanics coming from Mexico. So although you have a very high level of diversity among the so-called Hispanic community, you still have, you know, a core block, okay? Mexicans. Muslims, they're coming from 200 countries. They can't define themselves by their country of origin. It's not going to work, okay? So they have a high level of group consciousness, but it's not related to their country of origin, and it's not related to their immigrant experience. It relates to the fact that they're perceived as being an homogeneous group in the US. Okay? Not based always on negative stereotypes, but based on the fact that other religious groups are also identified as being homogeneous. Although we know that it's slightly more complicated, but still. National identification, because most of the literature say, well, if some migrant minority groups have a very high sense of self-identification, it means that they are less likely to identify with the country they live, okay, with the national values and so on. And I prove in my book that, no, that's wrong. They have multiple identities as a Muslim or Hispanic, Latino, whatever, and American. They combine the two senses of belonging, that they're not mutually exclusive. So I say, okay, if they feel strongly part of the nation, they're all going to rush and ask for naturalization, especially in the context of security governance, where, you know, you can always be deported. Okay? So, in order to preserve your rights, your civil liberties, not to be deported, you're going to rush and ask for naturalization. Guess what? Hispanic, no. Yeah, they fear deportation. That's obsession number one among Hispanic communities, especially because now almost 80% of Hispanic families are mixed, meaning legal, illegal, okay? So there is always one member of the family that can be deported. Okay? But this is not an incentive for naturalization. There are many other explanatory variables. Not all of them are fluent in English. Socioeconomic status. It's too complicated. They don't have time. And after all, life is okay if you have a green card or even if you're illegal in the US. Why bother? Okay, but I thought it was interesting. Despite the very low level of perceived group discrimination, but at the individual level, this is not good enough to become an American citizen. By contrast, and when I say low, it's about 46%. And Mexicans have the lowest naturalization rate, 36%. Okay, although they're target number one, okay, that's not strong incentive. Muslims, by contrast, very high. When I say very high, it's 81%. Okay? Socioeconomic explanation, level of education, they have the money, they have the social capital, and when we ask them, why do you want to become an American citizen? Just because they want to become more American. No security concerns, okay? No, oh, I may be deported or something like that. No, it's out of their frame. Interesting. So, step number 3. Remember, discrimination, subjective discrimination, subjective integration. What do they want to do? Okay. Now, mobilization. And I take into account various forms of mobilization, conventional, non-conventional, also new technique of mobilization, including social media. And we need more work on mobilization through social media. And with or without the use of violence. But also, if mobilization was based on identity politics, to promote a Hispanic agenda or a Muslim agenda, or just, you know, to be part of the political process without playing the ethnic or the religious card. So I ask 2 central questions. Does security governance change the scope, content, and forms of mobilization of targeted groups? If it does, to what extent and in which fields? Conventional electoral participation and conventional politics, non-political involvement. For example, there is the assumption that if you're discriminated against, it may be more difficult to be part of a political campaign or to run for an office because, you know, you'll be targeted. But therefore, maybe there is a trade-off. If political participation is becoming too complicated, maybe non-political participation will be, you know, easier, and you know, we may notice an increase of unconventional mobilization. So I wanted also to study the trade-off, okay, conventional and conventional participation. And these summarize the chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 5 on conventional and conventional mobilization, naturalization, voting, political affiliation, political representation, unconventional, non-electoral activities, social media, and so on, with the different kind of mobilization from we do nothing, we don't care, active non-incorporation, unable to vote, but I'm not interested in politics, for example. Protest politics with, without values, radicalization, political religions. And I wanted to understand if it was sequential, simultaneous, or if there is, trade-off between conventional and unconventional mobilization. Key findings: naturalization rates, as I say, very low for Hispanics, very high for Muslims. But when it comes to voter registration, these two categories are underrepresented. And I know it's counterintuitive because, once again, when we think about Hispanic in the US, we think about the Hispanic vote, okay? But no, it has to be put in perspective. Latino, for the moment, represent only 10% of eligible voters. Only 10%. Okay, that's... They're very vocal, okay, very well organized. Think about organization, La Raza, and all the groups and everything. In some states, okay, swing states, they play a key role. But globally, Latinos are politically underrepresented. For Muslims, it's even worse. I mean, you have few Hispanic, even Buddhist, okay? Muslims are less represented than Buddhist in the American political system, to give you some idea. Why? Attitudinal engagement. That's the way we measure interest for politics at the federal, state, local levels, okay? While both Hispanic and Muslims are not very interested in American politics. But it doesn't mean that this is because they're more interested in the politics of their country of origin. There is no trade-off. They're just not interested in politics, like many other non-Muslim, non-Hispanic Americans. So it's extremely mainstream. It's not, oh, they don't want to integrate, they don't want to participate. No, they're extremely American. Like a lot of people, they don't vote. They don't read the news, they don't care, okay? Except when it comes to pay taxes. But apart from that, there is no specificity of an Hispanic or Muslim profile. No, absolutely not. Political representation, high, proportionally, okay, among Hispanics, very low, as I say, among Muslims. And for Muslims, Islamophobia is still playing a key role. It's still very difficult for a Muslim candidate to be a candidate, okay? Say, because it will be suspected of promoting a Muslim agenda. So it's okay if you're in New York. It's not okay if you try to win election in Oklahoma, for example, okay, where they even ban the Sharia. There is no huge Muslim community in Oklahoma, just if you wonder. And the few Muslims wandering around, okay, trying to move out of the state, never ask for the implementation of the Sharia. Okay? So, local matters. Okay? And even for the federal elections, most of the non-Muslim candidates are not so crazy to be on the same picture or selfie with a Muslim representative. Okay? Sorry to be blunt, but if you're Muslim, you can provide your moral support, you can provide your money, but no selfie. Okay? Don't advertise that you support X or Y candidate. So, security governance and unconventional mobilization. If it's so difficult, for so many different reasons, for Hispanic and Muslims to to engage in conventional mobilization. What's going on with unconventional mobilization? So we may wonder if security governance has affected the unconventional mobilization of discriminated immigrants and minorities. Does security governance hinder non-electoral participation, or does it provide new incentives to lobby and demonstrate? Think about the 2006 Latino demonstrations, okay? When Congress wanted to vote a bill, you know, about more restrictive border controls and more criminalization of illegal immigrants and so on. Thousands of people demonstrated in many different American cities, okay? Not in Oklahoma, okay? LA, Seattle, New York, you know, but not along the border. Do obstacles to traditional political involvement lead to an increased interest in other forms of mobilization, or do they fuel civic apathy, you know, doing nothing? I don't care. Is unconventional mobilization actually providing mechanism for the democratic inclusion of targeted groups? That's one of the major assumptions of the traditional literature. If you're part of an organization, for example, it's supposed to be the first step towards political traditional participation as a sort of training, you know, training session. Or does it reflect the emergence of new forms of collective behavior? If so, what is the main goal? Becoming part of the political community, or avoiding incorporation into politics as usual? That's the question I address in the final chapter of the book. Key findings. Both American Hispanic and Muslims, as well as Muslims in Europe, are engaged in various forms of mobilization. So when you have studied, especially those on the pessimistic scenario side, okay, saying, well, they don't vote, they don't register, they don't, you know, they do nothing. Hey guys, look what they're doing on the side, okay? The unconventional forms of mobilization, they're doing a lot. Many forms of unconventional participation. The relationship between integration and mobilization is complex. A successful socio-economic integration can lead to active conventional political participation. Okay, that's the straightforward line of integration. Okay, socio-economic integration, cultural integration, political incorporation. Okay. It can also result in strong involvement in protest. That's related to the integration paradox I mentioned before. You Muslims in Europe, well-educated, born, raised in European countries, decided that because they have a sense of resentment, relative deprivation, they're not interested in traditional politics, but they're more interested in protest politics, with or without the use of violence. Their delusionment renders them less likely to be supportive to conventional democratic politics, and in turn, more likely to participate in acts of political protest. That's the integration paradox. I mentioned that, I emphasize that, because most European governments think that they should increase or improve socio-economic integration, which they have to, they should do that, okay? But their expectations are wrong. It's not going to improve the political traditional participation of these minorities, okay? Because of the integration paradox. So we are raising a generation of angry young men, which is not good. Hispanic in the US, consequential, simultaneous involvement in conventional and non-conventional activities. This is not because it's too difficult to be politically engaged that they're going to increase their level of unconventional mobilization. No. It depends on the opportunities at the local level. So, in Arizona, for example, very difficult to engage in political, traditional participation, okay? But protest politics demonstrations, not so easy, okay? Especially because in Phoenix, for example, you have some Hispanic organization trying to help the local population. But along the border, there is no one, okay? There is no Latino organization, okay? So you can't knock on the door and say, hey, can you help me? No, there is no one, okay? Meaning that they're going to favor other forms of mobilization, to be part of a church, a religious organization, a cultural organization. And it's not because there is a high density, okay? Some people tend to believe that when you have a large size of immigrants somewhere, it's going to increase the level of unconventional participation. Well, I demonstrated that it was wrong. When you have a high density of ethnic concentration, people don't need to be part of a religious or ethnic organization because they already live among themselves. They don't feel isolated. So it's the opposite. It's when you feel isolated that you feel, the need to join an organization, to be part of a community. Muslims, too difficult to be elected, okay? So they tend to prefer other forms of mobilization, except protest politics. We haven't reached the stage where we can expect huge Muslim demonstrations similar to the 2006 Hispanic demonstrations in the US, okay? They tend to walk on tiptoes, find their way, develop their organization. They do a wonderful job at the local level, okay? But they want to remain discreet, okay? Not to catch too much attention. And so they're very active, okay? But quite silently for the moment. Although there is intense use of social media. Muslims in the US use social media much more than Hispanic in the US. And I don't know if you remember a few years ago when Newsweek, there were a cover with a picture of a guy during an anti-American imperialism demonstration, and it was the guy with the title Muslim Rage. I don't know if you remember that a few years ago. And with no indication of the location of the demonstration, who was this guy, nothing. So, Newsweek apologized after. But this started a hashtag movement, Muslim Rage. An American Muslim used the Muslim Rage, okay, with a great sense of humor, saying, for example, my son's name is Hijab. I can't scream his name in the airport, okay? And hashtag Muslim Rage, okay? So it was devastating. It was so funny. I went to the hairdresser, wonderful blow dry, nobody can sit. Muslim rage. Okay? So, and they use humor like that, and it was very effective. Okay, very effective. Okay, so that's the end of that. Actually, security governance, there are two ways, okay, in which security governance affect mobilization. First, it hampers the democratic inclusion of groups objectively discriminated against into the political system by erecting a series of obstacles such as limited actual citizenship rights in Europe and overt political discrimination. But security policies have also provided new opportunities for targeted populations to mobilize. Both political, non-political forms of mobilization are facilitated by new social movements, mediating institutions, such as ethnic religious organizations and interest groups that have emerged as a response to concerns about discrimination and the subsequent potential radicalization of ostracized minorities. As a result, all the groups studied in my book are simultaneously marginalized and mobilized, recognizing the significant variations among ethnic groups and socio-economic subgroups in their form and degree of mobilization. The less integrated groups have a very positive perception of the host society, the immigrant optimism paradox, okay? When you're newcomers, you're very happy. You tend to believe that you're going to make it, okay? Or that even if you're Muslim discriminated in the US, it's still better than living in the suburbs of Baghdad, okay? So, still better. The migrant optimism. But what is more problematic is the integration paradox. Minorities that are born in Europe or in the US, targeted by discrimination, racial profiling, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and so on, that tend to resent their situation and to become more radicalized. In the conclusion of the book, it's mostly in Europe, but we have some trends that we need to pay attention to. Retreatism, minority, especially young Muslims, who decide, I don't care, I don't want to be part of anything, because anyway, even if I try very hard, I will be still discriminated against. Radicalization, political, religious radicalization, and finally, terrorist activism. So that's the three trends that, constitute something quite threatening for the future of democratic European societies that relate to my first book, Frontiers of Fear, because the tendency of the governments is to address these trends by more restrictive immigration policies, more securitized integration policies, more policing social minorities, more violation of civil liberties in the guise of the fight against terrorism. And I'm not sure that it's going to improve the situation, quite the opposite. Thank you.
I think we can start question and answer period, and I will ask those who will be asking questions to introduce themselves and their major and maybe what their interest is. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Nurieni. I'm an international student from Indonesia, and my interest is in the terrorism and security studies. So I'm a PhD student, and this is my second semester. So I will ask about the methodology for your research. Is it like, how do you measure the emotional dimensions? Is it like mixed methodology using quantitative and qualitative, or is it like purely quantitative? And then the second question is like, what about the gender dimensions for like your respondents. Like, are there any difference when you ask the female or the male questionnaires, respondents for the Hispanic or Muslim groups? Are there any difference? And then, like, do you put the gender considerations into your quantitative methodology?
So as I said, this book is part of a global international research program, SOMI, Securitization of Migrant Integration, and with two teams, the American team working on Muslim in New York, Boston, and Hispanic in New York and Arizona, and the British team working on Bangladeshi in Tower Hamlet, that's the largest Bangladeshi community in London, Sikh and Muslim Nigerian in London. So, in this book, in this book, I use mixed methodology, okay, from different perspectives, okay, political science, migration studies, integration studies, but also social psychology. That's a key ingredient. So I mentioned Megan, Megan did a wonderful job trying to select the most relevant literature in social psychology, and social psychology dealing with the impact of perceived discrimination on different minority groups in different countries. So I collected existing surveys, existing articles, and I combined the survey, the data and everything with some interviews, the key findings of interviews published by some of my colleagues. Okay, so I did not provide fresh data in this book, okay, because we are still collecting the data, surveys of the different groups I mentioned in the US and in the UK, and interviews. So we are coding the interviews, we are coding all the data, and it will be not maybe a second book, but an edited volume that will complement this, okay? But yeah, mixed methodology, quantitative data, qualitative. I use the official reports, I use publication by different migrant groups and communities, organizations and everything. Male, female, there almost nothing about the gender dimension among Hispanic. Okay, believe it or not, you're Hispanic, that's it. Male, female, okay. And very few data, reliable data for Muslims in the US. When you look at Gallup survey, Pew survey, or even survey conducted by Muslim organization and everything, in terms of perception of security measures, integration, conventional, unconventional forms of mobilization, almost nothing. There is no distinction male-female. The main distinction is US-born or foreign-born. Okay, that's okay. Or Shiite, Sunnite. Okay, that's male-female, nothing. In our work, I introduced the female-male, the gender dimension in the survey and in most of the interviews. For example, I started to analyze for a conference in June in Paris, so I have some preliminary findings of the Muslim survey in the US, and I also work on the Bangladeshi because the people who conducted the survey and the interviews don't want or not able to code and use the data. So I volunteer, or I think they decide I was the one in charge. I guess I was not in the room when the decision was made, but anyway. So I have some preliminary findings. And for example, when you look at answers to the question, are you part of an organization? Some people if so, what excited and say, well, they're less, there is, maybe they're not so Muslim after all. There is a low sense of consciousness or something like that, because you know there is no activism. But in fact, I added a series of questions. The most obvious one was why, and most of the women say, well, I have to deal with the kids, I have to do with the cooking, I have to do with this and that. Sorry, I don't have time, okay, even to go to the mosque, okay. So it's not that they're less religious or less involved in some Muslim activities or whatever. Very simple. Sometimes, you know, the best answer are very simple. They just don't have time. They have other things to do. Among Hispanic, I don't know yet, because Karina is in charge of coding and all the data, survey interviews and everything. I don't know. But I suspect that we will have the same trend. So it's not that women are less interested in politics or less interested in religion, less religious than men. No, they have other things to do. And the only finding in Europe was about sense of discrimination. Okay, perceived discrimination, men and women, and in some countries, women feel more discriminated against than men because of scarf.
Absolutely, I am living it.
That's it. But at the group level, not at the individual level. And there are significant variations from one country to another. Very simple. In some European countries, veil, scarf, hijab, burqa, you have the whole range, are banned. Okay? So of course you feel more discriminated because it's illegal. It's very simple. In countries where it's okay, they feel less discriminated against as a group. That's the only data we have in Europe. But nothing about political participation, interest in politics, unconventional participation, no. People, and you know, it costs a fortune to conduct interviews and survey and so on. So, and we are running short of money. We are at the end of the project. I wanted to include African American Muslim, but we don't have enough money. I will have to find another source of funding because they're black and Muslim. I thought it was an interesting group, but okay, I'm writing round proposal, African American Muslim.
Question?
Yeah, Andrew Graves, first semester master's student in global affairs. My question might be a little bit tangential to what the actual focus of your study was, but my question is, how aware do you think policymakers are that their restrictive policies are actually counterproductive to their stated objectives? Is it that they're ignorant of research such as yours and others, or is it that it's a calculated political move in the climate that we find ourselves in? For example, the Trump Let's Build a Wall movement. There seems to be actual legitimate political traction that one can gain from that kind of rhetoric, even if objectively it won't help what they're claiming the reason for doing that is.
I didn't address this question in this book. I addressed in the previous one, Frontiers of Fear, and there is one chapter entitled, Why Did Failed Policy Persist? Okay, so I was, as you, puzzled, okay, what's going on? Maybe they don't want to read my books, okay, nothing personal, but I'm not the only scholar in immigration studies, integration studies, saying that further restrictive border control measures, not going to solve the problem, okay? Because most of the illegal immigrants did not cross the border. They're visa overstayer, okay? About 54%, 55%, okay? So half of illegal came into this country with document, okay? But they decided to stay. So you can build the Chinese wall along the Mexican border. It's not going to solve the issue of illegal immigration in the US, as it's not going to solve it in Hungary or in Ceuta and Melilla. You have 25 walls around the world now, okay? Including one in now Arabia Saudi, okay? They try also to. We know it's not going to work. So I say, okay, it's not working. So why each administration, Republican, Democrats, they say we need more patrols, we need more funding, more staff, more drones, more militarization of the border. What we know, it's not going to solve the problem. Well, there is one answer. The objective is not to solve the problem.
So it is political.
Absolutely. So I have a sub-section in this chapter, which is called the hidden agenda. Okay? It costs a lot to control the borders, but it's also an extremely profitable business. Okay? For all the security actors involved, for all the cooperation, sending drones, sending military equipment to the Department of Homeland Security. It's very lucrative. Second, we need illegal immigrants in this country, at least along the Mexican border, to pick up the fruits in California. So you have the business owners that don't want an effective implementation of controls, because they're very happy to have a cheap labor force. Okay? So you have many other reasons. Second, you have to please your electorate. If you say, well, it didn't work in the past, but I'm going to do better. To do better because I'm going to do more of the same. Okay? It's very reassuring, okay, because it's very simple. When you say to someone with no knowledge, we're going to limit the number of the people in this room by locking the door, it makes sense, okay? In reality, we know that there may be another door, or if you don't close the windows, people can come in through the window, okay? But it doesn't matter. It's simple, okay? So it creates, and one of my good friend and colleague, Peter Andreas, wrote a beautiful book, Border Games, okay, in which he explained very clearly that the goal is not to control the borders. That's not, that's not the point. It's just to pretend to control the borders. It's a theater with actors playing specific characters, okay? And when you add security concerns, saying, well, if you don't want me to lock the door, it means that you support terrorism. Okay, I'm going to spend more money, send more staff, just in case. Imagine that someday a Mexican decide to become a jihadist terrorist. Just in case. That's the worst case scenario approach. So,
Sure.
Why do failed policy persist? There are many reasons.
If I'm asked a follow-up, that was an example with the United States. With Europe, as you mentioned, that if the second generation citizen of an immigrant is born in the country, they still don't have citizenship. Is that also an example of a policy that you would say that has a hidden agenda attached with it? Is there a political rhetoric against that?
Yeah. You have to preserve the identity of the nation by preserving the quality of its components. Sorry to be blunt, but okay? So that's not only the quantity, but the quality of the people who want to be part, you know, to join the salad bowl or the pot or whatever, okay? So, yeah, and instead of working on that, addressing the issue of the integration paradox, because of security concerns, now the majority of European governments include even more restrictive requirements for citizenship. Okay, there is a securitarization of citizenship requirements. No,
it's not apples to oranges.
No, I refuse this kind of categorization because my research position was not to categorize these people, but to ask these people how they define themselves.
Okay, so that's how you're able to.
Yes, and it's not because you are defined as being a Muslim that you're Muslim. Okay, okay, yeah, I'm a Muslim for the others, but you know, I maybe decide to be a woman first, or you know, or any other identity markers. And you can be a cultural Muslim, meaning you like some traditions, family traditions from your country of origin and everything, but you're not religious at all. That people have the choice. So I refuse pre-categorization. That's why my work, and that's why the survey we conducted and the interviews we conducted are so complicated, because we didn't ask, are you Muslim? No, for our research design, it would have been completely counterproductive. So we asked people, how do you define yourself?
Questions? I will ask the question. So there is another narrative that goes parallel to securitization. This is like lone wolf terrorists, yes, that exists. And then the question is, did you look at the alienation within the communities themselves? Because then those young men who like bomb the trains and everything, they are not accepted neither in the community, how the narrative implies, or outside of it.
I address this in Frontiers of Fear, based on the assumption that sense of alienation, deprivation, and everything facilitate radicalization and therefore terrorist recruitment. Okay, it was one part of the chapter, and I was unsatisfied with that, which explained why I asked another question: how does it feel to be a threat? Okay, and in this book, I developed the notion of radicalization. I want to be very clear. There is a political radicalization. For example, you have Muslims in Europe that now vote for extreme right-wing parties. Okay, we have Muslims in France voting from the Front National. Okay, it's like black people voting for, supporting the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, to give you some idea. But they have good reasons from their perspective. Okay, they have good reason from their perspective. So there is the radical, the political radicalization, okay? And then you have the religious radicalization. You have some Salafist movement. But I don't have the assumption that it's because you're part of a Salafist organization that you're going to be a terrorist, okay? You have different kind. Salafist is part of retreatism. They want to live among themselves, okay? It's like Mormons, okay? They have their own stuff, okay? They don't want to interact. It doesn't mean that they're going to bomb Paris. Then, working parallel of this book, Frontiers of Fear, I work a lot on terrorist radicalization. So there's some passerelle, but that's very different to some extent. And that's why I'm always very careful to say terrorist radicalization is part of the global picture, but be careful. Don't suspect every angry young Muslim in Europe to be a potential terrorist, okay? Or don't believe that deprivation or alienation generate terrorists. This is much more complicated. And there is no terrorist profile. Some of the terrorists are extremely well educated. They were well integrated into the host society. Not to mention convert, okay? Not even born Muslim, born in the country, raised in the country and everything. There is no terrorist profile. There are trends, okay? Trends. Sense of relative deprivation. That's something in common, okay? Either if you're well integrated or not. What is important is the subjective perception by these people of their situation. That's why it's so difficult to spot them. Or we need a new machine able to read, you know, what's going on in the head of everybody, okay? And I'm not sure I want to reach that stage, okay? But it's very hard. Okay? Look at the socio-economic profiles of the perpetrators of the Charlie Hebdo attack. Some of them went to jail. Okay? It doesn't mean that all the Muslims who spend some time in jail are going to become terrorists. You have others very well educated with no delinquent background at all. And then we don't know. There is something, you know. My concern is that counter-terrorist policies are supposedly designed to target these people. By definition, it's impossible to identify these people. So you have everybody are subject to these very restrictive counter-terrorist policies in order to catch some guys that by definition you need to pray God or your grandmother or whatever to be lucky enough to prevent a terrorist attack. It's intelligence that matters. It's not immigration policies. You can strengthen the borders. We need more intelligence, but not to the detriment of civil liberties. Because if so, it fuels the sense of relative deprivation, sense of alienation and everything. And if it's not create a new generation of terrorists, at least it will make easier for them to justify their action.
More questions? So,
on that happy note.
Thank you, Dr. Chebel, for your lecture.
Thank you for the invitation.
Informative and inspirational.